How's everybody doing? Deidre Truemaster is in the house here, who brought the house down. So hopefully we'll continue with some of that spirit from last night. This lecture is concerned with hip-hop poetics. But first, shall we dance? Right here, let's dance.
I'm ready.
Okay. Now we're ready to start. Don't dance before giving a lecture. Okay. Today we'll be exploring hip-hop as a poetic genre, possibly the most widely disseminated genre of poetry to exist in human history. If there's anyone who wishes to debate me on this assertion, feel free to challenge me on it in the Q&A. In spite of a clear relationship between hip-hop verses and poetic verse, or more precisely, the obvious conclusion that hip-hop verse is poetic verse, the study of hip-hop poetics is extremely limited. While Harvard and Cornell universities both house expansive archives of the hip-hop genre, the studies of its poetics are in its infancy. This lecture aims to shed light on this relationship by examining the manners in which we interact with hip-hop poetry, uncovering the poetic forms promoted by the genre, establishing some of the historical associations that illustrate hip-hop's connection to literary poetics, and exploring how the marginalization of women's voices in hip-hop suppresses the breadth of the genre's thematic range. It was Soul Williams who said, "Not until you've listened to Rakim on a rocky mountaintop have you heard hip-hop." To take that statement a little further, I'm tempted to say that you haven't understood poetry until you've read Rakim's Performativity by Tracie Morris while listening to It Takes Two by Rob Bass and DJ Easy Rock. You can see that's Rob Bass and that's Tracie Morris. Perhaps this correlation is a bit uneven. After all, Rakim's Performativity is an essay, not a poem. But when I read Morris's essay with the assistance of Rob Bass, it felt like I understood poems on another level. Upon further reflection, my revelation may have less to do with the poetics of Morris's essay, which is brilliant and carries a poetic sensibility for sure, but more about a deeper connection to the poetry being revealed by Rob Bass. The seminal dance track, It Takes Two, arrived on the scene in the fall of 1988. I remember the first day I heard it. I was in a car with my father in New York City. I sat calmly in the back seat, happy to hear DJ Red Alert on Hot 97. It Takes Two seemed okay at first listen, but the track hadn't entered my bones yet. It wasn't until 3 months later, on a dance floor in my hometown of Binghamton, New York, yes, it took that long for the song to travel up to Binghamton, that I began to realize I had experienced a vital moment of history in that back seat. The breadth of It Takes Two couldn't be understood in a hot car with my pops in NYC. No, the complete depth of this seminal work required the setting of Images, an under-18 dance club nestled in the back of Ramada Inn on Front Street in Binghamton, New York. It was there, hair freshly gelled, blue silk shirt on, and acne medication applied, that I learned my first lesson in hip-hop poetics. It Takes Two has become one of hip-hop's foundational dance anthems. In fact, few songs, if any, can be considered as fundamental. One could surmise that this story would further prove the primacy of hip-hop's direct association to music and dance, and perhaps it does, but I would contend that cold evening in Binghamton revealed to me another important element of hip-hop. While we shook our booties, we were shouting the lyrics, or more appropriately, we recited poetry at the top of our lungs. That first night I just faked the lyrics, pronouncing the handful of end rhymes that I remembered from that journey with my dad. But we came back every week and recited these rhymes until our throats were sore on into the summer. If we check out the first 6 lines, I want to rock right now. I'm Rob Bass and I came to get down. I'm not internationally known, but I'm known to rock the microphone because I get stupid, outrageous. Stay away from me if you're contagious. Now, I'm not going to say these are the most profound or well-crafted lines written in hip-hop history, but a cursory look over these lines reveals one very obvious point. These are lines of poetry. In her essay, Rakim's Performativity, Tracie Morris discusses J.L. Austin's theories on performative utterances, aka performativity, how both he and Rakim explore language's performativity in society. When analyzing language and hip-hop in general, and about Rakim specifically, she says, those of us with great affection for the genre, particularly those of us who came of age during the music's coming of age, immediately before and during its mass commercial production in the late 1970s, noted the initial application of conventional poetic form that relied heavily on end rhyme use, punning, and topical wordplay. Morris reveals an important point here regarding hip-hop poetics, the awareness of its lyrics functioning as poetry. In fact, the recognition of hip-hop within its community as a form of poetry dates back to the inception of the genre. One of hip-hop's preeminent torchbearers, KRS-One, whose name stands for Knowledge Reigns Supreme Over Nearly Everyone, is the co-founder of the Mortal Crew Boogie Down Productions, BDP. His partner was the late Scott LaRock. A decade before the shooting deaths of Tupac and Biggie Smalls, LaRock was killed, the first member of hip-hop royalty to meet such a fate. BDP, with KRS and LaRock, had just set the world on fire with their debut album, Criminal Minded, a few months before LaRock's death. Double XL magazine chronicled the following events that took place exactly 1 day after his murder. The very next day, KRS, D-Nice, Red Alert, and the rest of the BDP family took the stage at MSG. They stood silently for a moment. The crowd seemed unsure how to react. Then a huge photograph of Scott was lowered from the ceiling. The stadium exploded, and the crew launched into a stirring version of Poetry, a shared moment of hip-hop healing. The poetry the article is referring to is the title of the first track from BDP's debut album, Criminal Minded. Similar to the experience that my peers and I shared at the Images Dance Club, the crowd of Madison Square Garden seemed to share a religious experience, collectively mourning to the incantations of poetry accompanied by a musical beat. Morris's assertions that the early aficionados of hip-hop were keenly aware that this language was an application of poetic form suggests a long-term embrace by the hip-hop community of its poetic identity. Further evidence of this relationship was found during my high school experience, as well as the cathartic encounter shared by the BDP fans at MSG on August 28, 1987. Such connections do not necessarily explain the depths of hip-hop as a poetic form. Rather, they illustrate the relationship between hip-hop's community and its poetics. While earlier correlation between Rob Bass and Morris's essay in relation to one's ability to understand poetry might have been slightly overstated, a more precise interchange may have been revealed by me on a Facebook status update last spring. While working on my critical thesis, I posted the following proclamation on my wall. You haven't read poetry until you've read Shakespeare while listening to Mos Def. Big Will. I'm actually not talking about Shakespeare or Mos Def at all, but I decided I wanted to put the pictures because they're both so cute. This characterization felt accurate to me at that point in my research as I was immersed in a project of applying scansion to hip-hop rhymes. Adam Bradley, in his book, The Book of Rhymes and Poetics of Hip-Hop, makes the claim that hip-hop verses are formalist poems, and like many previous formal poetry schools, hip-hop is married to rhyme. You know, in the come on in. The post Marco Rubio water incident, it's hard to take a sip of water when you're in front of him and not feel like Marco Rubio. So this is my Marco Rubio moment. like many previous formal poetry schools, hip-hop is married to rhyme. I found this revelation to be both intriguing and mind-blowing as I began to do research for my critical thesis. I started to see hip-hop verse as the newest school of formalist poetry and set out to apply scansion to its rhymes. The first verse I decided to scan was Ebonics by Big L. So in your packets there, and unfortunately I think they're already all taken, so you have to look with your friends. So there's actually two handouts. There was like a little one-page addendum. So I'm going to warn you guys, it's about to get like really nerdy up in here. If you are interested in knowing more about specifically meter, there's a book, and I reference it on the handout. It's called Paul Fussel's Poetic Meter and Poetic Form. I give you a basic layout of what the metric measurements are for iams and trochees and all that stuff, which I'm about to talk about. So, and this is all stuff I wrote about in my critical thesis. So, I guess theoretically, if you're so super interested, you could go and get it here because it's like available or something. Okay. Boom. There it is. Okay. So, the choice of Ebonics seemed appropriate considering that the track could easily serve as a glossary for neophytes trying to dissect the meaning of hip-hop lyrics. Some interesting trends emerge when scansion is applied to this verse. The following is a tally of the metrical feet from the verse. 38 iams, 29 trochees, 8 spondies, 6 pyrrhics, 2 anapests, 2 critics, and 1 dactyl. The bulk of the poem interchanges between iams and trochees with an apparent, though slight preference for iams. When it varies using disyllabic feet, or doubles, the verse employs a similar amount of pyrrhics and spondies. When the poem chooses a more complicated variation employing trisyllabic feet, aka triples, it uses an identical amount of anapests and critics, with the one outlier being a lonely dactyl. The dactyl appears at the last foot, suggesting that the variation from the overall pattern is intentional. So there. The second track I applied scansion to was Let Me Blow Your Mind by Eve. And you should see that like figure 2 is in there. Eve utilizes trochees and iams, employing a similar ratio as Big L. It is not surprising that they primarily employ trochees and iams, since the majority of the English language varies between these two metric measurements. What is most interesting are Eve's choices for variation from the trochee-iam dichotomy. When employing disyllabic variations, Eve strongly prefers to use pyrrhics. Unlike Big L, who seems to appreciate the spondee and pyrrhic equally, Eve only uses a spondee once in the entire verse. The metric tally for her verse is 19 iams, 16 trochees, 1 spondee, 6 pyrrhics, 6 anapests, 1 critic, 1 antibacchius, 3 amphibrax, and 2 bacchius. So there. Again. While L's primary metric variations are spondies or pyrrhics, which are disyllabic feet, Eve shows a clear inclination towards 3-syllable feet, evidenced by her use of 13 triples in this verse. Triples account for approximately 24% of the entire verse, as compared to Big L's verse, where triples make up less than 6%. Equally as interesting is Eve's variation within her usage of trisyllabic feet. Big L only utilizes 3 different types of triples, the anapest, the critic, and of course the lonely dactyl. Eve, on the other hand, uses 5 different trisyllabic feet, the critic, the anapest, the amphibrat, the antibacchius, and the bacchius. In her use of triples, Eve shows a strong preference for the anapest, using it 6 times. The apex of her anapest usage takes place in line 6, where she treats the reader or listener to 3 anapests in a row. In the lab, pen and pad, don't believe. She revisits the anapest at the end of line 7 with my own lines to accentuate the experience from the previous line. It's clear that Eve, like Big L, hears the sonic qualities of these metric variations. That's even Big L, by the way, obviously. To say that they are making intentional metric decisions by ear is important to uncovering the motives of hip-hop MCs. I'm not suggesting that MCs are sitting down and writing up poems counting iams and trochees in the manner of formal verse artists from centuries past. It is clear, however, that they make intentional metric decisions. The selective employment of accents and syllables will replicate these choices in order to create an effect that Bradley refers to as the rhythmic ideal, while also varying from previous established patterns in order to develop signature styles. So take that. While It might be challenging to picture hip-hop MCs as formal verse poets. What would it be like to imagine a 16th century British poet as an MC? But hey, if we're making bold proclamations, let's go as far as to say you can't understand rhyme until you've read the 16th century English poet John Skelton out loud over the beat to I Got It Made by Special Ed. But since there's a possibility that you will go home and forget this exercise, I've decided to do it for you right now. In order to ensure proper pronunciation, I traveled to England and spent countless hours working to perfect my understanding of 16th century linguistics. And if you happen to be a linguist with any familiarity with the English language pre-1600, you will soon know that my previous statement was total BS. But I'll give it a shot anyway. Y'all remember this one? This is called A Ballad of the Scottish King. King Jamie, show me your joy is all go. He summed it up, King, why did you so? To you no thing, it did accord. To summon up King, your sovereign Lord. A king, a summer, it is wonder. Know ye not salt and sugar asunder? And your somni is ye word to Malapert and your herald? No thing expert, ye thought ye did it to Valentola, lie, but not worth 3 skips of a pie. Sir Squad Galliard, ye were too swift. You will reign before your wit. To be so scornful to your ally, your consul, was not worth a fly. Before the French king sings another. You ought to honor your lord and your brother. Trow ye Sir James's normal grace. For you and your Scots were torn his face. Now ye proud Scots of Galloway. For your king may sing well away. Now must we know your king for your regent, your sovereign lord and precedent, and him is figured Melchizedeki. And ye be desolate as on Maleki. He is our noble champion, a king anointed, and ye be none. Doesn't Skelton kind of look like a rapper too?
You got a hat on sideways.
I know, right? Kind of funny.
Yeah, I mean.
And he's like, I knew this would happen one day. Had to wait 400 years. A contemporary artist named Cannabis is a Toronto-based MC whose Poet Laureate series reveals a similarity in style to Skelton, who, like Cannabis, was also a self-proclaimed Poet Laureate. In fact, one could imagine Cannabis writing the following lines directly to Skelton. Also, here's a good way to sort of hear how hip-hop advances lyrically and with its sort of variation compared to, say, the raw bass lines. They barely understand you. The unseen hands that sample you and command you, it's quite puritanical. Henry Louis Gates Jr. said I was a lyrical computer, a great leader of a spiritual movement, Homo Noeticus student, the cosmic human, Homo Evolutus, divine rulers from a digital future. I'm not a poet, I'm a poet, not a puppet. I spit these rhymes without a budget. While Cannabis has had many write-ups regarding his rhyming abilities, John Skelton has gotten some ink recently as well. On March 14, 2011, David Kester in the Rochester Oratorio Society newsletter pondered the question over whether or not John Skelton was the godfather of rap. Kester points out that Skelton had many other things in common with hip-hop artists, including his emergence from obscurity, a tendency towards political statements, and even a prison bid. Fans of hip-hop poetics will take issue with the suggestion that Skelton is the godfather of rap. After all, there can only be one godfather of rap. Gil Scott-Heron, poet and author of The Revolution Will Not Be Televised, is hip-hop's godfather, at least according to the New York Times and numerous other outlets. The title of Father of Rap is also taken, as highlighted in Jeffrey Chang's groundbreaking book, Can't Stop, Won't Stop. That title belongs to Cool Herc. That said, this doesn't mean that Skelton doesn't have a place in hip-hop history. Perhaps he is the great step-grandfather of hip-hop. By drawing connections between Skelton's work and modern-day hip-hop, we're able to see how the written word can possess a natural musical rhythm created by its language. In fact, the lessons of Skelton's work in relation to hip-hop function as a symbiotic counterpoint to the lessons learned from applying scansion to hip-hop rhymes. In the case of scansion application, we find poets writing for performance in music, but utilizing tools that are reminiscent to the devices employed by literary poets from centuries past. Conversely, Skelton's work illustrates the manner in which poems written to be read from the page can be composed in the architectural style of hip-hop rhymes, which were written first and foremost to be heard. Now, if Skelton's hip-hop sensibilities establish him as a forefather of the genre, perhaps Francisco Pessoa would be hip-hop's 27th cousin. Continuing with the trend of making bold proclamations, I'd like to declare that one cannot understand heteronyms until you've listened to M.F. Doom while reading Francisco Pessoa. So, I didn't put their names under them, so I wanted to see if you guys could figure out who's Pessoa. And that really is like an iron mask on his face, by the way. So in your handout, there's a section called Francisco Pessoa vs. M.F. Doom. So read while the music is being played, okay? And that's just to yourself. Don't like go crazy and start spitting Pessoa rhyme stuff out. Oh, I'm sorry. I meant you can't understand persona poetry until you've read Alberto Cairo while listening to Victor Vaughn.
Jumping up your man, no spend that 10 bucks. I did it for the advance, the back end stuff. Better than sitting up in the crack there, so the Mac and left yelling at some fiends and friends and stuff. I spent at the door, always just FedEx. I thought I heard walkie-talkies must have been the redneck neighbors of mine. Like they fucking with their TV, having with the spot watching cops on TV.
Actually, what I maybe meant to say was that you haven't had your mind blown until you read Álvaro de Campos while listening to King Ghidra. In case you're not following, while I've mentioned half a dozen poets, I've only referred to two humans, Pessoa and Doom. Each of them utilized aliases or heteronyms as Pessoa labeled them. Pessoa, who boasted 70-plus heteronyms, used these alter egos to explore the concept of persona poetics. M.F. Doom did the same thing with his heteronyms, Vaughn, Ghidra, Zev Lovex, Danger Doom, and many others. Utilizing the alter egos to create different personas in order to experiment with poetic narrative. The heteronym may be the most unconsidered connector between traditional poetry and hip-hop. While Pessoa, the father of the heteronym, changed the modern view of poetic voice, hip-hop artists from Mos Def, a.k.a. Black Dante, Jack Johnson, or Yasin Bey, Eminem, a.k.a. Marshall Mathers or Slim Shady, or Jean Grey, a.k.a. Run Run Shaw, employed the alter ego or heteronym to establish the range of poetic voice embodied through his many personas. Pessoa's many personas. Kind of fun. So, there. While a discussion of alter egos helps highlight the flexibility and ingenuity of hip-hop narrative, any discussion of narrative would be remiss without an examination of messaging. Hip-hop has come under fire for the glorification of violence and its overt and consistent objectification of women. To be clear, this is not the lecture that's going to discuss the poetics of It Ain't No Fun Without the Homies by Snoop Dogg, who coincidentally has changed his heteronym to Snoop Lion. But I digress. This lecture will not apologize for hip-hop's misogyny, nor will it spend much time addressing it. Instead, this lecture will discuss a less reported aspect of sexism in hip-hop, the marginalization of women's voices in the genre, in order to elaborate the depths of hip-hop poetics. While sexist lyrics have taken center stage in mainstream hip-hop, more feminist female voices have been written out of its history. While many lectures could be dedicated to discuss the impact of women on the poetics of hip-hop, taking a moment to acknowledge some of the seminal female poets that have contributed to this genre is appropriate and necessary. In fact, If I may be so bold, I would like to say that you don't have a clue about hip-hop poetics unless you've read June Jordan while listening to M.I.A. For the past 30 years, during every stage of its development, female MCs have lent their voices to the hip-hop organism. Skilled poets such as MC Light, Queen Latifah, The Real Roxanne, Roxanne Shante, Yo-Yo, Sister Soulja, Moni Love, The Lady of Rage, Lauryn Hill, Rod, Digga, Ladybug, Mecca, Queen Pen, M.I.A, Angel Hayes, and C. Watt Say have composed complicated and relevant rhymes that extend the breadth of the genre. Understanding the contributions of these talented MCs to hip-hop poetics helps establish the genre as a whole, intact and varied arena for creative voices. This lecture began with a discussion of the female poet Tracie Morris's musings on Rakim, performativity, and poetics. A fitting bookend might be possibly the greatest battle rapper written by none other than the famous poet June Jordan. How's everyone doing out there? Y'all with me? Good. What is June Jordan, a bisexual female poet born in 1936, educated at Barnard College, who served on the faculty of Sarah Lawrence College, Yale University, and the University of California, Berkeley, have in common with hip-hop? At first glance, the narrow sighted would estimate very little, but a closer examination of her background begins to reveal a more clear connection. Born in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn, Jordan hails from the neighborhood which has possibly birthed more famous MCs than any other hood in the nation. Famous Bed-Stuy rappers include Jay-Z, the Notorious B.I.G., Mos Def, Talib Kweli, Papoose, Lil Kim, Foxy Brown, and many others. Jordan and several of the aforementioned MCs are immortalized in murals across Bed-Stuy, a visual example of this poetic relationship. Jordan came of age in a time of profound racism, and like her successors, writing poetry became her outlet for expressing the complicated emotions surrounding her challenging upbringing. It's not difficult to picture June Jordan walking down Fulton Street, scribbling poems, traversing the same path where Biggie Small decades later would compose rhymes in his head while dodging cops. In her lifetime, June Jordan published 28 books, but one work stands out as a shining example of hip-hop poetics. In her iconic work, Ode to Eminem, we find the late, great Jordan excoriating the famous rapper for his misogynistic and homophobic lyrics in the tradition of the rap battle. Her fierce challenge to Eminem preserves the architectural design of hip-hop utilized by him while writing over it with a queer feminist lens. Jordan's contributions establish a clear connection with literary poetics and hip-hop by proving that a master of the literary form can function effectively within the newer, edgier, more contemporary one. The commercialism of hip-hop has minimized the contributions of women to the genre. Spotlighting the role of women in hip-hop helps dismiss the argument that is merely a narrow, male-driven art form unworthy of deeper examination. While sexism in hip-hop is a serious concern, I feel confident in saying if June Jordan were here with us, she would say that hip-hop doesn't have a monopoly on misogyny in literature. Wink, wink. In fact, the presence of feminist hip-hop helps discredit one of the primary criticisms against the art form, that its narrative scope is too limited. In addition to the issue of narrative limitation, June Jordan helps us debunk another myth of hip-hop. But first, let's see what former U.S. Poet Laureate Robert Pinsky has to say on the matter. When posed the question, is hip-hop poetry, Pinsky said that, for me, a crucial thing about poetry is that it is written for anybody's voice in a culture in which we worship performance. Here, Pinsky is suggesting that hip-hop is composed and geared towards performance, which, while possibly compelling, is fundamentally different than poetry, which was meant for the reader's voice. Pinsky goes on to say, I do make a distinction between the art of the performer and the art of the poet. I don't write poetry readings. If I give one, I try to be boring. I try not to be boring. It's kind of funny how I said it. Sorry, Robert Pinsky. He's going to be so upset with me. If I give one, I try not to be boring, but I write poems. I write with my voice for your voice. His assertion is reasonable, but what about the voice that my friends and I were shouting at the Images Dance Club back in '98? Were we offering our own voice to Rob Bass's poem, or merely mimicking his? And what about the fans at the Madison Square Garden who collectively recited the lyrics from a song called Poetry along with the BDP crew? And how about the meter that was uncovered when I chose to view the rhymes of Big L and Eve on the page and mine them for actual syllabic patterns? Or how about the rhymes of John Skelton and their ability to fit nicely alongside a modern hip-hop beat? Was Skelton writing for performance? Personally, I disagree that poems have to be written for the reader without consideration of performance. Such a conclusion limits poetry to a narrow definition existing exclusively for the page. Some poems are written primarily for performance, and some are written primarily to be read, and many poems juggle both concerns equally. In the case of Rob Bass, what matters to me is that my friends and I were concerned with the language of his song, and particularly the rhythmic flow of his words. While we were thrilled by the music and the underlying beat, we were also impressed by the arrangement of the lyrics. Rob Bass and all MCs utilized poetic devices to entice their audiences. Some of these devices work as effectively on the page as they do in performance. As I mentioned earlier, Tracie Morris said that her and her peers noted the initial application of conventional poetic form in hip-hop, revealing that form is a central concern of MCs. Furthermore, the application of scansion in hip-hop rhymes reveals clear intent regarding the manipulation of accents and syllables in the effort to create a coherent and smooth composition. And this conclusion is flipped when we see how a poet like John Skelton, writing centuries before the existence of hip-hop, wrote works that can accompany a conventional hip-hop beat with relative ease. Also, establishing the range of hip-hop narrative by highlighting the employment of tools like the heteronym further illustrates the many layers of hip-hop's poetics. And finally, debunking some of the myths of hip-hop regarding its relationship to women helps reveal hip-hop's thematic diversity and helps uncover some of the missing connections that can resolve the debate regarding hip-hop's relationship to literary poetics. In the case of Robert Pinsky's challenge to hip-hop, and the questions he poses regarding its relationship to poetry, June Jordan emerges with a firm and clear answer. If we momentarily accept Pinsky's assertion that poetry, in the truest sense, must not be concerned primarily with performance, then the existence of Jordan's Ode to Eminem poses an important question. If hip-hop existed solely as a form written for performance, would a literary poet like June Jordan be able to create, in my estimation, one of the greatest battle rhymes ever written? This iconic piece was not written for a record contract. Timbaland never made a beat to accompany it, and Rihanna hasn't sung a fancy hook for it. In fact, when June Jordan wrote this poem, she knew that it would be read by an audience familiar with the genre and by many readers that were not particularly versed in hip-hop. She knew it would make sense to her audience and that a beat wouldn't be necessary for it to be effective. So hip-hop doesn't necessarily have to be written for the performer's voice. The form can function on the page, and oftentimes does, even when it's intended for performance. In the case of June Jordan's work, we find a perfectly composed hip-hop rhyme written to be read by others. So take that, Robert Pinsky. And this brings us to the conclusion of this lecture. But first, it will be my pleasure to share with you an excerpt from Ode to Eminem by the late great June Jordan. I think it should be in your handout too. I'm the slim lady, the real slim lady, the real slim lady, just a little old lady, I'm the slim lady, the real slim lady, all them other age ladies just trying to page me. But I'm the slim lady, the real slim lady, and I will stand up, I will stand up. Don't tell me who pissed or who's slashing whose wrist or pretend about risk to a blonde millionaire with a bodyguard crew that pray behind shades and that pay to get laid. What's that about fair? I'm not through with you. I'm the bitch in the bedroom, the faggot you chump. I'm the nigga for real, so get ready to deal. I'm tired of wickets that whine as they squeal about bitches and faggots and little girls too. I'm an Arab, I'm a Muslim, I'm an Orthodox Jew. I'm the bitch come to take you, I'm the faggot to fake you. Out of the closet full of the slime you deposit. For fun, rhyme and run, you the #1 phony ass gun. Oh, I am that I am and I don't give a damn, but you mess with my jam and I'll kill you, I will. Hey Shady, you know what I'm saying. I'm just playing. You know I love you. Sincerely, Slim Lady. So I think I got about 10 minutes if anyone wants to ask any questions. Mr. May.
Yo, I just want to throw in real quick on the Pinsky thing. interesting. I think when those conversations come up and we talk about like, well, I think poetry isn't just there to be lit for performance, has to be for a page to be a poem. It's interesting how these very knowledgeable writers conveniently forget that poetry predates literacy.
Right.
In pre-literate culture, poetry was vital. So to say so, is he saying that that the Iliad is not poetry and that Beowulf is not poetry?
Right.
Because they weren't writing those, they were memorizing them and reciting them. They were written for performance. So I think, and he knows this, but it's interesting that dissonance where you can say, no, if it's written for performance, it's not a poem, while knowing that there were poems thousands of years before the advent of the printing press.
Yeah, when I first met with Ralph Angel, who was my second semester advisor, and I talked about my interest in hip-hop poetics, he's like, poetry is a written form. It's like new, essentially. You know, as an oral tradition, like, you know, through its prime, you know, through its history. So it's right. You know, that's totally true. And there's so many more connections we can get into on that line too.
Yeah, I was wondering if you think that the formalism of hip-hop, which differentiates it from a lot of other contemporary poetry, is going to end up changing the way that we do contemporary poetry.
I think to a certain degree, yeah. There's an anthology coming out. I don't know when it's coming out, but it's they just closed their submissions, and it's called "It Was Written," and it's an anthology of poetry inspired by hip-hop. And so I think what you saw with Jordan, which she did a while ago, and she's passed several years now, you're seeing a lot of MCs doing this. Willie Perdomo is a great example of this. Poets who are basically taking the hip-hop form and putting it on the page. So I think you'll see more of that. So yeah, I think so, for sure. What Adam Bradley says in his book is that essentially contemporary poetry abandoned rhyme, and that hip-hop essentially came in sort of like around the back corner or something, because humans need rhyme and demand it. I don't know if that's true or not.
I should say first, I'm relatively ignorant in this genre, except, you know.
Yeah, except for she edited the first ever article published in Essence magazine about hip hop. But go ahead.
That's actually true. So you can read about that later. But what was I say? But I'm not challenging what you're saying about the lineage. Queen Latifah was in that article. But I still, some of the stuff when I hear it, I just wince. It's like a visceral thing.
Absolutely.
So I wonder if you could say a little more about how you deal with that significant problem, not to take away from your extremely valid point.
Yeah, well, I think that one of the reasons I decided to highlight the fact, because one of the things, it's like as if women don't exist in hip hop, right? But from the beginning, women have been making rhymes that many of them, not all, some of them, some people like Lil Kim or whatever, do it in the same tradition of violent gangster rap. But the point is that there's a lot of MCs who are writing rhymes, some of which are misogynistic, and those are the ones that are most likely to get played, and it is a real problem. I mean, it's actually, one of the things I'm happy about is that we finally come to a time, I think, where people are really challenging it, more so than in the past. A good friend of mine is Rosa Clemente, who was the vice presidential candidate for the Green Party, and she really challenged Rick Ross when he came out with his lyric that was basically a date rape lyric. And then he lost a bunch of his sponsors and stuff. So I think that when this first started happening, we're all kind of in the club. We're like, oh well, yeah, we're just kind of pretending it away, And I think people are now more challenging in the blogosphere and stuff like that. So I think that's good. I think it is problematic. I also think that literature is full of misogyny, and that hip hop unfortunately continues that tradition. Yeah, go ahead.
So actually, I was really fascinated by you bringing up Pessoa, who is a favorite of mine. And Pessoa was also very, very perfectly bilingual. He was Portuguese and English. And so I don't even know if these poems that you cited were actually written in English.
Yeah, they were written in Portuguese.
They were written in translated. Because he wrote poems in English also.
Yeah.
So it was a really interesting comparison, because then I think about hip hop and I think about the culture. And in a way, it's almost like in the same way that Pessoa was, there was a tension between two languages that was in Pessoa. And then in hip-hop you have African-American discourse and culture and language, and also sort of a mainstream English discourse. And I'm wondering whether you think that friction between those two ways of expressing actually might account for some of the richness.
Well, it's interesting because the track I have in here, Ebonics by Big L, it's like almost like, all right, I'm going to do you as a favor. And explain all this stuff. And those stories, literally, piece of it. This is what this is. This is what this is. This is what this is. So, yeah, you know, it's interesting. I also think of, and this isn't quite answering your question, but I think hip hop is also creating language too, which is pretty cool. But also, at this point, it actually is a multilingual art form. Like, it's in every language that people are performing. And I was in, like, the middle of nowhere in, like, this small indigenous village in Mexico, and I'm, like, walking by a house, and they're blasting some, like, indigenous hip-hop on, like, their, whatever, they had, like, a tape player or something, you know? So, I think you had your hand up, didn't you? Yes, you.
Yeah, I had two things. Well,
Yeah.
I forget the word you used, but it was like pseudonym when...
Heteronym?
Heteronym.
Yeah.
So where does the line get drawn between that and schizophrenia? I mean, it's just a tool that people use.
That's a great question, right? I mean, I don't know if so much schizophrenia or multiple personality disorder you're talking about, but yeah, I mean, I think that, Francisco Pessoa had, and I'm not, there's other people who probably know a lot more about his work, he had like 70 different identities, but hip-hop MCs, that's what they do, is they create different identities, you know, and some people like MF Doom, who I talked about, he's got multiple, he's got like, you know, 7 of them, and he just could be any one of them at any point. It's really about persona poetics, so persona poetry is what it is. I thought I had a question for you. Yeah?
I was thinking about your lecture coming up when Jean Valentine was giving her talk, and it's a more complex question than I think I can formulate. It's a little messy in my head, but do you think that silence is cultural in poetry?
So I think, man, of course Jen Bourbon's got to ask. I think silence is cultural in poetry. That's a really interesting thing. I mean, you know, I wonder. That's a good question. I know it's like, I don't know that I can answer that question, but I think it's really intrigues me that some people like they want to like shout poetry at the top of their lungs, and other people want to like really quiet. I think people are really entertained when it has a performative element to it, when it's like loud, or when it's when it's emotive. And is that culturally maybe? But then, the different argument, right, is that, like, I think that, like, people like John Skelton, like Shakespeare, they were kind of, like, gritty and raw people, and so I think that those poets from back in the day, they were, like, gritty and raw, and I think that there's a reason why hip-hop has sort of spanned across cultures, because people like that, the rhyme, the playfulness, and the rawness, Jamal?
Sorry, the silence thing just made me think about, because I was listening, watching you kind of show the evolution of form, and it's interesting to think that like poetry kind of took a really long time to start changing up the kinds of, the rigidity of the form, and I think about hip hop as such a young art form, and it made me think a lot about the way caesura is used and kind of some of the more modern stuff, like music like Kanye West or Drake, like how big the pauses are, and I think it's interesting to think about I don't know what it's called, a blank beat or something. And I just thought that was the idea of silence. Like how I just noticed when you listen to a track now versus the track from when I was growing up, there's way more space. Like and they kind of was just like, like Rick, like you mentioned Rick Ross, like he'll say a line, and it'll feel like it's like 20 minutes before the next line comes in. And I just think that's like, and then and getting off the beat more, like that's the kind of things I'm seeing more and more of. And I just think and I hadn't thought about that parallel to how poetry was really rigidly metered and rhymed, and then kind of started opening up more later.
That's interesting. I think that one of the things that you find, I definitely know that like the silence is put in there more. People play with it, and I think the most important thing to say is like this is like the tiniest slice of it, because it's like this discussion is barely happened, really. Like there's so many directions to go. Like you could just nerd out on like one tiny aspect of this. Like if you want to just do caesuras, like you could spend 30 years studying just caesuras and hip hop. You could spend, you could write a whole book on the meter of Tribe Called Quest, So also remembering that there's so much to get into, so it's kind of hard to pull it all together. Do you have a question?
It's just a barely formed thought, but I just wonder if economy and the possibility of pay, financial reward or anything comes into play at all, like in any of their research. Following on the question of silence is cultural, I just wonder if there's any lens of economy or marketability or something like that, commercialism, that might provide a way in as well.
Well, I mean, at the very least, it's like, what does it mean? Like, imagine, like, one of the things we talk about is how, like us poets, we joke with the fiction writers about how we're all poor, you guys might write this great bestseller. But if we bring hip hop into our world, I mean, there's like poets who are like making millions of dollars going to like recite their poems or music. And so how does that affect it? What does that mean? Like, you get $1 million for a poem. It might change how you craft the poem, right? Great. Unfortunately, this is the last question, I'm sorry.
I want to go back to the first question that Jamal May talked about in your response. You're talking about how poetry, as it might have been defined before hip-hop, is really a small amount of time, and that oral history precedes the quiet written word by a long shot. And yet, you ask anybody whether hip-hop is ingrained in their personal history or culture, they'll recognize Robert Pinsky as a poet, but not necessarily will Robert Pinsky or his friends recognize M.I.A. or Rob Bass as poets. You make a great argument that hip-hop is poetry, so we're all convinced. People who understand hip-hop are convinced, but not enough people are convinced. So what does hip-hop do to make that argument stronger and convince everybody that it's all poetry, or at least hip-hop is a part of poetry?
Well, one of the things that Greg's actually touching on is actually one of the hugest debates on the subject right now, because essentially, I didn't even get into it in the lecture because the whole lecture would have been about this issue, but essentially, one of the issues why are you even trying to legitimize hip-hop? Like, hip-hop doesn't need poetry. It doesn't need to be, legitimized at the level of the academy. It doesn't need all that. Like, why are you even doing that? And that's some of the criticisms of Adam Bradley's work, for sure. And so, I don't think hip-hop needs that recognition. I don't think that it needs that recognition. I think that for those of us, I think that there's the inevitable fact, because hip-hop is such a deep, very poetic form, that it will be studied at the academic level 100 years from now. And I think those of us who came up in the genre, who were influenced by it, who performed in it, it makes sense that some of us write the history of it. Because otherwise it's going to be cats, so it's people who were born in, wherever, in like some suburb are being born now who are going to write like the treatise on hip-hop as a poetic form. And people are going to study it. That's going to happen. So I think it does make sense for those of us who were part of the genre, who were influenced by it from its basically inception, to have a stake in how it gets its story gets told as a poetic form. So the last thing I'll say is that those of you who are going to AWP, I am serving on a panel called Uncovering Hip-Hop Poetry at the AWP conference in Seattle, so check it out, and we're way over time, so I thank you all for coming out.